Deep in the shadows of wartime Asia, there stood a place shrouded in secrecy. Its existence was whispered among those who knew, but for most, it remained just a rumor, an enigma behind locked gates and silent corridors. Here, the walls held secrets that would shape the course of history, even if the world would not know it for years to come. It did not exist on any official map. It had no public name, no visiting dignitaries, no inspections. Yet inside its walls, some of the darkest decisions of the Second World War were made. History remembers the battles. It remembers the generals and the surrender ceremonies. But hidden far from the front lines, another war was unfolding. A war fought not with tanks or artillery, but with pathogens, frostbite, and human bodies treated as disposable instruments. In the 1930s, as Imperial Japan expanded across Asia, military leaders became obsessed with a new frontier of warfare. Chemical weapons had already terrified soldiers in World War I, but biological warfare promised something more insidious, invisible, denied, untraceable. In 1932, after occupying Manchuria, Japan established a secret research program under the command of General Shiro Ishii. Officially, it was called the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. The name sounded humanitarian, defensive, necessary. But honestly, it was none of those things. Soon after, the heart of this program took shape. The Japanese military built a massive facility, tucked away from prying eyes. This place would become infamous as the Pingfang Complex. It was designed to be self-sufficient, with its own power plant, laboratories, and, well, everything needed to support a secret operation on a huge scale. Security was tight, and the entire area was shrouded in secrecy, making sure that hardly anyone outside the military knew what was really happening inside those walls. Deep in Pingfang, near the city of Harbin in occupied China, a sprawling complex began to rise. It looked like a research facility. It had laboratories, dormitories, warehouses, even a prison block. The compound was heavily guarded. Local civilians were kept away. Those who entered as prisoners were rarely seen again. The program would later be known as Unit 731. Ishii convinced Japan's high command that biological weapons could cripple entire populations without firing a single shot. If successful, they would give Japan an advantage no other empire possessed. The logic was cold and strategic. The execution would be far worse. Thousands of Chinese civilians, Korean prisoners, and later Soviet captives were transported to the facility. They were labeled logs, a dehumanizing code meant to obscure what they truly were: men, women, and sometimes children. Inside the compound, doctors and scientists in military uniform prepared experiments designed not to heal, but to observe death in controlled conditions. As the years went on, the reach of these experiments grew, spreading far beyond the walls of the original compound. The shadow cast by these secretive operations began to touch more lives, often in ways that, honestly, would remain hidden for decades. What started as isolated tests soon became a vast network, with consequences that, well, would echo through history. Diseases such as plague, cholera, and anthrax were cultivated in massive quantities. Fleas were bred by the millions. Frostbite studies were conducted during the brutal Manchurian winters. The justification was always the same: national security, scientific advancement, preparation for total war. Few outside the inner circle knew the full scale of what was happening. Even within Japan's government, knowledge was compartmentalized. Secrecy was absolute. Records were coded. Orders were verbal. The facility operated in shadows, but, shadows have weight. By the early 1940s, the program had expanded dramatically. Satellite units were established across occupied territories. Field tests were planned. The laboratory was no longer just studying disease, it was preparing to deploy it. And as the war intensified, the scientists at Pingfang were about to move from experimentation to something far more irreversible. By 1941, Unit 731 had evolved from a hidden research center into a full-scale biological weapons factory. What began as theoretical study was now operational science. The goal was no longer to understand disease, it was to weaponize it. Inside the compound, vast fermentation tanks produced lethal bacteria in quantities never attempted before. Plague bacillus, cholera cultures, typhoid strains refined for maximum lethality. Scientists worked day and night not in pursuit of cures but in pursuit of efficiency. Human beings became living test chambers. Prisoners were deliberately infected and monitored as symptoms developed in real time. Doctors recorded fever spikes, organ failure, and the speed of death. No anesthesia was used during procedures. The pain was considered irrelevant to the data. Vivisections were routine. Subjects were cut open while still alive so researchers could observe how disease ravaged the body. Lungs collapsing under pneumonia, livers swollen from infection, blood thickened with bacteria, the heart still beating as notes were taken. Ishii insisted that only living bodies provided accurate results. Other experiments explored environmental killing methods. Prisoners were exposed to extreme cold until limbs froze solid, then thawed in boiling water to study tissue damage. Some were strapped into pressure chambers to simulate high-altitude bombing conditions until their organs burst. Others were deprived of food and water to track the timeline of starvation. But the most chilling phase came when the lab moved beyond controlled testing. Unit 731 conducted field experiments on entire villages. Aircraft dropped plague-infected fleas over Chinese cities. Wells were contaminated with cholera. Food supplies were deliberately poisoned. Outbreaks followed with horrifying speed. Civilians died in waves, often without understanding what was happening. Japanese troops sometimes advanced into areas already weakened by disease. The strategy was ruthless. Biological warfare could soften resistance, create chaos, and reduce the need for prolonged battles. In some regions, tens of thousands perished from outbreaks directly linked to these experiments. And still, the program expanded. Special bombs were developed to disperse pathogens efficiently. Ceramic casings were designed to shatter on impact, releasing clouds of infected insects. The technology was crude by modern standards, but devastatingly effective. Unit 731 had achieved what Ishii promised, a silent weapon, one that left no bullet wounds, no explosions, only bodies collapsing from fever and infection. Yet even within the Japanese military, some officers were disturbed by the scale of the cruelty. Whispers circulated, rumors spread about the death factory in Manchuria, but no one challenged it. Success in war justified everything. As Allied forces closed in across the Pacific, the leadership of Unit 731 faced a terrifying reality. If the facility was captured, the world would learn what had been done, and the consequences would be unimaginable. So they prepared not for surrender, but for erasure. Records were scheduled for destruction. Prisoners were marked for elimination. The laboratory that had consumed so many lives was about to vanish into smoke. But secrets this massive rarely stay buried forever, and what would soon emerge would shock even hardened war crime investigators. In the final weeks of the war, as Japan's empire began to collapse, Unit 731 turned inward. Orders were issued to destroy evidence. Documents were burned, equipment dismantled, buildings rigged for demolition. But the most damning evidence was not paper, it was human. Prisoners who had survived infection were executed to prevent testimony. Some were shot, others were poisoned. The goal was simple: leave nothing behind that could speak. When Soviet forces invaded Manchuria in August 1945, the complex at Pingfang was already in ruins. Fires smoldered where laboratories once stood. The prison blocks were empty. The silence felt deliberate, but investigators soon uncovered fragments, partially burned files, testimonies from captured Japanese officers, local accounts of sudden epidemics and mass graves. The scale of what had happened began to take shape, not as rumor, but as documented fact. At the Khabarovsk war crimes trials in 1949, Soviet prosecutors presented evidence of biological warfare experiments conducted by Unit 731. Several officers confessed to human experimentation and field deployment of disease. The world listened, but the world did not fully act. Across the Pacific, American intelligence had already made contact with Shiro Ishii and his colleagues. The United States, entering the early Cold War, had its own interest in biological weapons research. Information gathered at Pingfang was considered scientifically valuable, and so a decision was made. In exchange for their data, many of the leading figures of Unit 731 were granted immunity from prosecution by U.S. authorities. Ishii himself was never tried for war crimes. He lived quietly after the war, his name largely absent from public reckoning for decades. For the victims, there was no immunity. Survivors in China carried physical scars and psychological trauma that lasted lifetimes. Families in plague-stricken villages never knew why entire communities vanished. The experiments were rarely acknowledged in post-war Japanese education. For many years, official recognition was minimal, contested, or denied. Silence became the final cruelty. The ethical collapse was not confined to one laboratory. It echoed through institutions. Medical professionals who had sworn to heal instead measured suffering. Military leaders who spoke of honor sanctioned deliberate infection of civilians. And global powers, confronted with evidence, chose strategic advantage over justice. The war had ended. The moral questions had not. Unit 731 exposed how easily science can be bent when fear dominates policy. When survival of the state eclipses survival of the individual. When secrecy shields decisions from scrutiny. Some defended the immunity agreements as pragmatic. The Cold War was intensifying. The Soviet Union was advancing. Knowledge, even tainted knowledge, was considered too valuable to waste. But at what cost? By the 1980s and 1990s, historians and journalists began uncovering more documents. Former personnel spoke publicly. Lawsuits were filed in Japanese courts by Chinese survivors seeking recognition and apology. Many cases were dismissed, but the historical record grew clearer. The laboratory that once tried to erase itself had left indelible marks, not only on bodies, but on the conscience of modern warfare. And as new technologies emerged in the 21st century, genetic engineering, synthetic biology, AI-driven pathogen modeling, the shadow of Pingfang stretched further than anyone had imagined. Today, the ruins of the Pingfang complex stand as a museum in northeastern China. Concrete foundations trace the outlines of laboratories. Rusted pipes once carried water, and sometimes disease. Display cases hold fragments of equipment recovered from the ashes of destruction. What was built to disappear now exists to remember. Yet for decades, Unit 731 remained largely absent from mainstream Western history. Unlike the Nazi medical experiments exposed at Nuremberg, these crimes faded into classified files and Cold War silence. The narrative of World War II focused on battlefields, not laboratories. That omission was not accidental. American military researchers incorporated portions of Ishii's data into early U.S. biological warfare programs at Fort Detrick. Official documents later revealed that the information was considered extremely valuable. The moral implications were quietly set aside. Justice had been traded for knowledge. In Japan, acknowledgement came slowly and unevenly. Some textbooks omitted the program entirely. Others referenced it vaguely. Government apologies were rare and carefully worded. Public pressure gradually forced greater transparency, but many survivors never saw formal recognition in their lifetimes. The wounds aged without closure. Unit 731 ultimately changed how the world approached biological weapons, not immediately through condemnation, but through fear of what was possible. The horror of weaponized disease contributed to international agreements like the Biological Weapons Convention of 1972, which banned development and stockpiling of such arms. But treaties rely on trust, and history has shown that secrecy thrives in fear. Modern laboratories around the world now possess tools Ishii could only dream of. DNA editing can enhance pathogens. Automation can mass-produce microorganisms. Digital modeling can simulate outbreaks before they occur. The same logic that fueled Unit 731 still exists. National security, deterrence, scientific advancement. The difference is scale. A single breach today could impact millions within days. This is why the story of that brutal military lab matters far beyond World War II. It is not simply a tale of past cruelty. It is a warning etched into history. When human beings become test material, the boundary between defense and atrocity vanishes. When secrecy overrides accountability, ethics collapse silently. And when power operates without oversight, suffering becomes data. Some experiments end. Their consequences don't. The ruins of Pingfang do not speak, but the lessons they hold are loud. They remind us that the most dangerous weapons are not always built to explode. Sometimes they are built to spread. And sometimes the greatest threat is not an enemy nation, but what governments are willing to do when they believe no one is watching, because once the line is crossed, returning is never easy. History does not repeat itself perfectly, but it often rhymes, and the echoes of Unit 731 are still being heard today, in laboratories, in policy rooms, and in the uneasy understanding that science without conscience can become humanity's darkest tool. The lab is gone. The question it left behind remains: how far is too far when survival is on the line?